Everyone can see the slides okay?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Let me move just a little bit of stuff around on my screen so that I can focus a little better on my attention. Albert and I have decided to take up two sessions. Thanking you all for for spending that much time with us. But when we thought about what we wanted to introduce and doing it in one session seemed to be a little ambitious. So we'll start with kind of part one tonight, and I will talk just briefly in terms of what we mean by cultural behavior science, what it is as a concentration area, some of the theoretical underpinnings, and the units of analysis, a little bit of a little big overview of the research related to it, and then some extensions thereof before we kind of jump into discussion. Next week, Albert's going to talk a little bit more about the integration of cultural behavior science and contextual behavior science and some ideas we have related to that. So it will feel, I think, somewhat anticlimactic at the end of today in some ways, but I think collectively the two presentations will work really nicely over the next couple of weeks. So thank you all for giving us the space to be able to share some ideas with you. So in 2019, the Association for Behavior Analysis International formalized cultural behavior science as a concentration area in behavior science. And in brief, what it does is brings together a broad range of behavior scientists with different influences, specializations, and focus areas from both within and outside of behavior science. And cultural behavior scientists are increasingly contributing to what we hope is a better understanding of the selection and maintenance of cultural practices, the processes involved in dynamic systems, and the interactions between and among complex systems such as political, economic, educational, and so forth, and the evolution of culture. So the research in cultural behavior science tends to focus on the selection of larger units of analysis, like interlocking behavioral contingencies that I'll talk a little bit more about later on, and how these interactions between or among two or more individuals occur, how the networks of contingencies in our social and cultural environments promote many people to behave in similar ways. So like some of the things we've been talking about in terms of creating cultural movements, if you will, and examines the interdependencies within, between, and among different organizations and systems to identify better organizational practices, and or to mitigate significant social issues. So some examples of what cultural behavior scientists typically study include cultural phenomena such as the seemingly simple exchanges between two or more people, the practices of a family, interactions among members of organizations or communities, and even understanding the interdependencies between and among key actors and sectors in the community. So several behavior scientists, including but not limited to Sigurd Glynn, Mark Mattini, Ramona Homenfar, and Ingen Sandaker, have been instrumental in providing a strong foundation for cultural behavior science. However, much of their work and the work in cultural behavior science more generally has been strongly influenced by Skinner's selection by consequences. I just want to kind of have a little aside here. This is one of my least favorite papers by Skinner. So I'm going to talk a little bit about it at the same time with the recognition that it's particularly limited and relatively short with respect to what ideas he does try to convey in it. But in short, in selection by consequences, Skinner builds parallels among what he refers to as three kinds of selection, starting with natural selection, moving into operant selection, and then finally cultural selection, or the selection that results in the evolution of social environments and cultures. So anticipating that we're all pretty familiar with evolutionary selection processes here, I'm going to skip over that a little bit and just elaborate briefly on operant selection processes, or the selection of behaviors of an individual by way of their consequences throughout the lifespan of the individual. And so in this figure, which is adapted from Glynn 2004, provides an example of how the process of operant selection acts upon a specific response over time. So what you can see here is a series of responses denoted by R1, R2, R3, and so forth, occurring within a specific environment or situation over time. One response denoted by R1, however, is reliably followed by a consequence shown by C1, while the other responses are not. The relation between the environment, the response, and the consequence collectively is the operant contingency, which results in the recurrence of R1 in similar situations across time, or what is also referred to as a behavioral lineage. In selection by consequences, Skinner indicates that the process or the evolution of culture presumably begins at the level of the individual. And he suggests that a culture evolves when practices originating in this way, via operant conditioning, contribute to the success of the practicing group in solving its problems. So he emphasizes that the process by which the evolution of a culture occurs is selection, and more specifically, cultural selection, elaborating that it's the effect on the group and not the individual reinforcing contingencies, which is responsible for the evolution of the culture. So Skinner's ideas regarding cultural selection are expansions of his analysis of social behavior and culture from his previous work, Science and Human Behavior, in which he defines culture as a social environment composed of all the variables affecting them, which are arranged by other people. Perhaps more simply, we can talk about it as a network of contingencies. So Glenn further expanded upon Skinner's ideas regarding cultural selection, emphasizing the importance of the social environment, and specifically humans' tendency to spend time in close proximity to one another, along with their sensitivity to operant selection, is critical to the initial formation of human cultures. So Glenn elaborates that culture begins with the transmission of behavioral content learned by one organism during its lifetime to the repertoires of other organisms, which then results in a new kind of lineage, which she called a cultural behavior lineage, which is the result of cultural selection. So in the figure shown here, which I've also taken from Glenn 2004, illustrates the process of cultural selection in a similar fashion to the figure we just saw regarding the process of operant selection. What's different here is that in cultural selection, Glenn proposes that the unit of analysis is the interlocking behavioral contingencies between two or more people, or referred to here as IBCs. And these IBCs function as an integrated unit, and they result in an outcome for the group that affects the probability of future recurrences of the IBCs. The outcome referred to, denoted by this O here. So what you can see here is a series of interlocking behavioral contingencies between two people, IBC1, IBC2, and so forth, occurring within a specific environment or situation, and again, over time. One IBC, in this case IBC1, however, reliably produces an outcome, or O1, while the other IBCs do not. The relation among the environment, the IBC, and the outcome of the IBC is referred to collectively as the meta-contingency, which produces the recurrence of one IBC, the one that results in the outcome, or the cultural behavior lineage. And I'm going to come back to this again in just a little bit, but I want to go some other directions first. So if you probably guessed by now, cultural behavior scientists are concerned with slightly different units of analysis than behavior scientists have traditionally considered. Generally speaking, we can think of these as cultural practices, and we might organize them into two types. The first type are culturants, which are formed by those interlocking behavioral contingencies, and the outcomes are the aggregate products that are then selected by a cultural consequence. The second type we talk about as macro behaviors, and these are formed when several individuals engage in a similar response that's under operant control, but it produces a cumulative effect on the environment. Both of these units consider how behavior occurs within a social or cultural environment, or with respect to other people or social stimuli. Each of these units of analysis also correspond to a different kind of contingency. So culturants, for example, are selected by way of meta-contingencies, and meta-contingencies are defined as the relation between interlocking behavioral contingencies, their aggregate products, or outcomes, which in combination form what's called the culturant, and a cultural consequence, such that the cultural consequence does the selecting, or in some cases, the aggregate product itself can do the selecting. Macro contingencies correspond to macro behaviors, and they're defined as individual operant behaviors and/or culturants that produce a cumulative effect that's impactful on the society or culture, but is not in a contingent relation with the individual behavior. So we're going to look at each of these units of analysis and the corresponding contingencies a little bit more closely now. So the central idea behind the meta-contingency is that when people work together, they may produce individual payoffs and aggregated products that result from coordinating several individuals' behaviors. The coordinated work and aggregate products may maintain a functional relationship with some external outcome. These payoffs for coordination do not preclude individual payoffs. Individual behavior may be maintained by individual reinforcement, while the coordination is maintained by the collective outcome. So in the example here, which is taken from Glenn and colleagues' 2016 paper, you can see the IBCs, or the interlocking behavioral contingencies, among 5 individuals who work at a shipping company. Each individual's behavior is contingent upon another individual's behavior, and collectively, they produce an aggregate product, or in this example, the box that contains the items to be shipped. The combination of the interlocking behavioral contingencies in the aggregate product form the culturant, and that culturant, or the combination of the IBCs and aggregate product, so many acronyms, can be selected by an external receiving system, or in this example, the individuals who purchase the item, which forms collectively the meta-contingency. So we can look at it in a different way. And again, you can see how one person's behavior serves as the antecedent or consequence for another person's behavior, collectively producing that aggregate product, creating the culturant in its entirety. And this culturant can enter into a meta-contingency if it's selected by an external receiving system, which results in its recurrence over time. In this example, we can see what Skinner might have intended when he noted that the total reinforcing effect, or those consequences generated by the group, is enormously increased in the process of cultural selection. So specifically, the goal that's scored in a football game could be a good illustration of that total reinforcing effect, something that is produced by 2 players whose behaviors are interlocked with one another, resulting in an aggregate product that's different than what perhaps one of them might have been able to do alone. So this example also highlights how the outcome of the IBCs, or that aggregate product or the goal that's scored, might have a selective function on the IBCs themselves in the absence of a selecting environment. We can expand a bit on the previous example and illustrate the function of an external selecting environment. So here, what I've added are the macro behaviors of the football fans who then cheer when this team scores a goal. So a couple of things that are important to note here. One, that even though the behaviors of the individuals are interlocking, each person's behavior is still governed by individual 3 or 4 term contingencies. 2, that the contingencies in effect in the social selecting environment are also explainable by the 3 or 4 term contingency. And third, the interlocking behavioral contingencies are not dependent upon the same individuals participating each time. So as you know, if you watch football games, there are multiple players subbing in and out for one another, but instead, it's the way the contingencies are interlocked and the outcome that's produced that's important in the formation of the unit of analysis, or the culturant. So we can also simplify the presentation of the meta-contingency like this, highlighting the critical components of the IBC's aggregate product that form the culturant, and then the selecting environment that produces a cultural, or that serves as a cultural consequence. And this brings our attention again to the culturant as a unit of analysis. And so in this case, the culturant is analogous, the culturant in cultural selection is analogous to the behavior in operant selection, and then to the gene in natural selection. So it's a unit of analysis and one type of cultural practice. The culturant is generally selected by an external receiving system, which is now fairly consistently called the cultural consequence. Selection by the cultural consequence in cultural selection is like selection by consequences at the operant level and survival contingencies at the biological level. Like at the operant level, the culturants must be recurring. So one instance of a culturant does not necessarily mean that there's a meta-contingency in effect. We have to see patterns over time. And the difference when we move from operant to cultural behavioral lineages is similar to when we move from the species to the individual. So it differs with respect to the unit and time across genes and evolutionary time for the species and natural selection, throughout the lifetime of the organism and specific to individual behavior and operant selection, and with respect to cultural practices across individuals and or generations in cultural selection. So this doesn't necessarily mean that culturants cannot happen only once. There could be a non-reinforced instance. It also doesn't mean that every interlocking behavioral contingency is a culturant. The culturant includes the aggregate product, unlike, for example, verbal behavior from a Skinnerian perspective, which consists of interlocked behaviors, but would not necessarily be considered a culturant because there's not an aggregate product produced in many cases. So just to summarize a little bit around the meta-contingency, the meta-contingency refers to the contingent relation between the culturant, or those interlocking behavioral contingencies and aggregate products, and the cultural consequence, which is often produced by an external receiving system or the social environment. The unit of analysis is a culturant, which is also considered one type of cultural practice. The process by which it recurs is selection at the cultural level, and it requires transmission across organisms. A culturant can maintain even if the person's behaving change, so long as the IBCs continue to occur and the aggregate product is similar enough to meet the selection contingencies. So now let's look a little bit more closely at the macro-contingency, or individual operant behavior and or culturants that produce a cumulative effect that's impactful on the society or culture, but is not in a contingent relation with the individual behavior. So macro-contingency is kind of a bad name for this concept. The example shown here, also drawn from the Glenn et al. 2016 paper, illustrates how many people engaged in the same behavior, smoking in this example, governed by the individual operant contingencies, produces a cumulative effect on the environment or culture and society, such as increased healthcare costs, higher rates of premature death, increased CO2 in the atmosphere, and so forth. The individual operant behaviors practiced by great numbers of people is representative of macro behavior, while their relation to the cumulative effect is illustrative of the macro contingency. The cumulative effect in a macro contingency can also be produced by other entities, so organizations or groups and so forth, in which recurring culturants also contribute to the cumulative effect, as in this example, which shows how the cumulative effect of increased levels of CO2 can be produced by the combination of macro behaviors, such as many individuals driving cars and or smoking, as well as the recurring culturants produced by factories, shipping companies, transportation companies, and the oil and gas industry. So importantly about the macro contingency is that it's not really a contingency in the behavioral scientific sense at all. The contingency suggested is that between the products of each individual's behavior cumulated to the degree that it has an impact on society or culture. It does not have a selective effect on the behavior of any individuals. It may, but in general, it doesn't. The behavior of each of the individuals is under the control of operant contingencies alone, at least in the purest examples. So the macro contingency does not involve a third kind of selection or cultural selection. It may include meta-contingencies, but it can also occur from the behavior of many different individuals who do not interlock in any way at all. Important to note, if you go back and look at some of this literature, is that the early papers before 2004 confused the meta-contingency with the now macro-contingency because the early papers described them as meta-contingencies. So it's a little bit of a mess to kind of weed through, especially in some of the earlier papers. So we're going to shift gears a little bit now to talk a little bit about the current state of research and practice in cultural behavior science. And just like in behavior science, we can categorize the primary areas of research much like we do there, in that research and practice in cultural behavior science tends to fall into three broad categories, including philosophical, theoretical, and conceptual considerations, basic research, and then cultural and community applications. Just for the sake of time tonight, I'm going to stay with just a discussion of the basic research in cultural behavior science. And I think we'll have some time after Albert's presentation next week to talk a bit more about some of the cultural and community applications and what we think is important to move the research further in that direction. So before I do that, though, I think it's important to note that much of the initial work related to cultural selection was primarily theoretical or conceptual. So from Skinner's 81 selection by consequences to Glenn's expansion of that work and the formation of the concepts of the meta and macro contingencies we just talked about, all of that work was based on theoretical or conceptual kind of ideas, expansions, metaphor of what we already knew about operant selection. In fact, the first experimental analysis of the meta-contingency wasn't conducted until 2009 by Vicky and colleagues, but the first mention of the meta-contingency by Glenn was in 1986, so there was quite a period of time before there was any experimental analyses of these concepts. In 2020, we conducted a review of the studies published in the chapter shown here, and we found that as of that time, there were over 40 experimental papers on the meta-contingency that had been published in English or Portuguese. The majority of these papers explore the concept of the meta-contingency and its components and the selection of the unit of analysis or the culturant using social dilemma games derived from game theory, frequently used in social psychology and economics, but with an analysis of the contingencies and conducted in an iterative fashion. So in that chapter, we not only explore the extant research up to that time, but we also provide an introduction to the basic features of the different experimental strategies and tactics, such as the iterated prisoner's dilemma game that have been used in human operant work that explores cultural selection. I don't have the time to go into all of these in detail, so I'm going to focus on just one as an example before we talk about some of the major findings of this research base more generally, and then open up to a discussion with some of the limitations of this work. So in a typical prisoner dilemma game, there are two players who committed a crime. They have been arrested, but the police don't have enough evidence to convict either unless one player betrays the other, and the players cannot talk to one another. So each player is given the opportunity to betray their partner or defect, or to remain silent or cooperate. And the choice to do one or the other determines the length of the prison sentence, which is dependent upon the choices of both players. So you can see in the payoff matrix here. So for example, if one player chooses to defect, but the other cooperates, shown in these two cells here, the player who defects receives no jail time, but the player who cooperates receives a maximum sentence. However, if both choose to defect, both go to prison, but the length of the prison sentence is shorter than if they were the player who did not defect when the other player had. However, if both players choose to cooperate, both will go to prison, but for fewer years than if both had defected, as in this cell here. So the better outcome for the group is contingent upon both players cooperating, and the individual contingencies promote defecting, and the players often do, even though this results in a worse outcome for the group. In studies that investigate the meta-contingencies, the players earn points by choosing one of two stimuli, usually X or Y, it's not very fancy, and the choice associated with individual earnings and interlocking behavioral contingencies in the sense that all players' choices affect the number of points another player earns, such that the combination of players' choices serves as the aggregate product. And so if we're choosing between X and Y in a four-person iterated prisoner's dilemma game, an aggregate product might be all X's, 3 X's and a Y, 2 X's, 2 Y's, so on and so forth. One of these aggregate products is selected as the target aggregate product, and upon the production of that aggregate product and no other, the cultural consequence is delivered. I'm going to zoom in on this so it's a little bit easier to see. The dependencies between the player's choices that determine the corresponding contingencies are the interlocking behavioral contingencies. The combination of the player's choices form the aggregate product, and together they make the culturant. The cultural consequence, or the additional points allocated to the group, given to all players basically, is contingent upon the culturant, which includes the aggregate product, and in this example is the 4 X's. So when all 4 players choose X, that produces the aggregate product that the experimenters have targeted for receiving the cultural consequence, and those are given in terms of bonus points. So the addition of the cultural consequence is a critical methodological distinction between the meta-contingency experiments and other behavioral research that might use an iterated prisoner's dilemma game. The points are divided equally among players and are often exchanged for money at the end of the experiment. But because players are predicted to defect given the operant contingencies, the payoff is better for them actually not to choose the X. The application and withdrawal of the cultural consequence contingent upon particular aggregate products increases the probability of coordinating their responses and thereby demonstrating the selective effects of the meta-contingency. So there are a number of interesting findings resulting from this body of research, not just based on the IPDG, but also the other experimental strategies and tactics. But all these studies are kind of exploring the basic processes involved in cultural selection. So one major finding is that this research does suggest that culturants can be selected by cultural consequences. And this finding has been replicated across different experimental strategies and tactics. Second, this body of research suggests that selection occurs in experimental microcultures, consisting of up to 4 participants, and the interlocking behavioral contingencies and aggregate products recur or persist across generations in the case that there are participant substitutions over time in the experiments. And third, something that we're going to come back to shortly, communication among participants is important, but not necessary for the culturants to form. So when participants are given the opportunity to communicate with one another, these culturants can form more rapidly, but communication is not required for their formation. And lastly, culturants are selected even when there's not concurrence between operant and cultural contingencies, as well as when operant consequences are of higher magnitude than what might be produced with the cultural consequence. So along with all other emerging areas of science, there are also a number of limitations in the body of research exploring these basic processes involved in cultural selection. I'm not going to go into an entire laundry list of them. I'm just going to mention a few here. First, experimental microculture work is not analogous to what I like to call the wild. Consider that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And so this research is limited in the sense that it explores just a small piece of a much bigger and more complex phenomenon. As such, it does not take into consideration some of the important concepts from contemporary system science, such as self-organization, nonlinearity, and other related concepts. Second, most of this research has been conducted in a limited temporal scale and with a small number of participants. So thus far, no more than groups of 4 people have been explored in these kinds of studies. And finally, there's been little focus on cultural transmission, communication and the related processes, or the nuances related to within and between group selection. So there's still quite a bit of work to do to see if these concepts are going to hold up over time with larger groups of individuals. And there's still a lot that we don't know with respect to how cultural practices are transmitted, at least from this body of research. Several researchers, though, would propose ways in which to overcome some of these limitations, starting with the first, or that experimental microculture work is not analogous to the wild, and that it doesn't account for self-organization and other concepts from contemporary system science. So Mark Mattini's work, for example, has offered what he calls cultural systems analysis, which he defines as a specialty area within ecological science that builds on recent advances in contemporary system science and provides tools such as the matrix analysis shown here, which can be applied to illustrate interdependencies between and among 2 or more cultural systems. Jonathan Crispin has offered the idea of cultural behavioral hypercycles, shown here, as a way to capture the dynamics of self-organizing systems and explorations of cultural change. And so basically showing kind of the feed-forward loops and interlocking meta-contingencies, if you will, for lack of a better way to kind of talk about that more simply. And Coutu and Sandaker suggest at least 2 selection processes are involved in cultural evolution. The first being the selection of cultures, or the selection of cultural social environments, which would be consistent with between-group selection processes. And the second being cultural selection, or how environmental settings select the behavior of individuals and cultural practices within the culture, which would be commensurate with within-group selection processes. Aesio Borba and colleagues, among others, have tried to address the limited focus on cultural transmission, building in participant replacements into their procedures in an attempt to parallel the transmission of cultural practices across generations. And Homenfar and colleagues have attempted to address the limited focus on communication and related processes, offering their expanded meta-contingency, which augments the two-term meta-contingency we've been talking about so far tonight, which includes just the culturant and the selecting environment. The expanded meta-contingency adds 3 additional terms: the cultural milieu, which is sort of the parallel to the antecedent and operant conditioning, or organizational cultural milieu. Those are sometimes used interchangeably, but are more often than not separated out a little bit more now. Consumer practices, and then group rule generation, feeding back in as a kind of a feedback loop there. So the role of language and communication in cultural behavior science is a topic that we're going to come back to next week with Albert's discussion with the benefits of integrating concepts from cultural behavior science and contextual behavior science. But I think we've got enough of an introduction right now to cultural behavior science that we can open things up a little bit for discussion. Albert and I have come up with a few questions that might be able to get us started here. We don't need to stick with these, and we have a couple of examples of ways in which we think cultural behavior science can be integrated into some of the work that we've discussed here over the course of this group's meetings. But I'll bring those up if we get stuck and don't have other things to talk about.